For part 2 of our NBA clustering by player archetype series, we're going to be picking up right where we left off in part 1, where we had decided that we're going to be using 13 components. And remember, in our principal component analysis, we brought in 30 advanced stats, and we're reducing that, just using some mathematical transforms with the PCA method, to bring that down to 13 numbers that we're going to be using to group the players by. So those are kind of taking the place of the stats. What it does, again, if you haven't seen part 1, please go watch that because we explain it a little bit more in depthly there. But basically, it takes the 30 and it analyzes them and reduces them down to 13 to help remove some of the correlation between different stats. So this should look familiar if we watch part 1. We come down, we calculate the rate of change going from component to component, and we settled it on 13. So moving forward from there, we're going to define our PCA analysis, saying we're going to use 13 components. Our components, then, we're just doing the fit transform over X. We need to create a data frame where the data is going to be these components that we just did here. And that transform, again, is basically just reducing it down to 13. So we're going to have a data frame here that's going to have a column for every principal component that we're using. It gets a little tedious here. If you wanted to use more, you'd have to kind of write this out for each one. I mean, you could write a little loop statement to automatically generate those in a list, but just to make it a little bit easier to see, we have 13 principal components, creating a data frame from that transformed data with these column headings. And then we're going to bring in a new column for player, and we're going to pull that out. Remember, at the very beginning of part 1, we established a data frame, the df player call, and that we're just pulling out that player because all of the data we've used has stayed in the same order. So we're just going to slap those player names right back on. And then we're just going to recall that same data frame and just put player at the beginning, because if we add it on this way, it's going to show up at the end. So that's all we're doing. So just you're going to go ahead and run that, and then we're going to take a look at it, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So each of these now, for every player that we brought in with our stat dump that we used, they now have a stat or just kind of arbitrary number that symbolizes the stats that were brought in under that component. 1 through 13, you can see there's a little bit of variation there. And now we're going to look at the explained variance ratio for each of those components. So you can kind of see this number here. If you remember from part 1, our explained variance ratio is going to be how much of the variance from our raw data set is carried through with this reduced data set. So by reducing the number of statistics from 30 down to this set of 13 representative numbers, we're bringing through 88.9% of the total information there, which this should match. Let's see, 0.886. If we come back up to our components 13, yep, so 0.886. So we double check there. That basically just tells us that we didn't mess this up, is really all we're looking at there when we sum those together. But it gets you a little bit of knowledge there as how much is coming from each principal component. So if we really wanted to, I mean, we could kind of drop off 12 and 13. They're giving us 1.7% information and 2.1, 2.2. So these are all things that you can kind of go through and fine tune once you get the base model building information down. And again, this example I'm using is obviously not the best group of statistics to use. There's no perfect number of components. There's no perfect number of clusters. It's all going to vary by the data that you use and how you want to use it. So don't feel like you're watching what I'm doing. You have to do exactly what I'm doing, and that's that. There's definitely a lot of room for you to bring in your own expertise and your own method of doing things to kind of make all of these your own. So moving forward here, after we've kind of gut checked ourselves, and we're going to define an X variable as a numpy array column stack for each of these principal components here. And basically all that's doing is assigning all of these. Again, we're taking the player name away. We're going back to just the raw data. There's no headers or anything and numpy arrays. So we're just going to kind of take all of this data and dump it into a numpy array, and the column stack is basically just recognizing the fact that principal component 1 is a set column. It's not just like a huge array of data with no rhyme or reason. Like, we have our set columns, and that's how we're going to stack them, is by our data frame columns. Then we're going to define an empty list for our silhouette scores. And remember, in the introduction to K-means clustering video, so 2 videos back, we did use the elbow method, which we also use to some extent here as kind of a visual analysis. But the silhouette analysis is going to be a little bit more specific. It's not one or the other with silhouette scores and elbow methods. I think they're best used kind of in conjunction with each other. But we're going to be using a silhouette score here to get you a little bit of exposure to both methods, and then you can kind of go do whatever you want whenever you want with that. What we're going to do here is the same thing we did to look for the number of components we wanted. We're going to run through a K-means algorithm for different numbers of clusters, and we're going to do a little bit of analysis on those, and we're going to see which one is best, or ideal. I guess there may not be a best one, but there can be an ideal one that we want to use. So we're going to look at from 2 to 19 clusters. Remember, in Python, the range is going to stop 1 before your final number there, because we start at 0 in the counting mechanism. So we're going to run k-means with our number of clusters equal to this variable, which is going to iterate up each time. And then we're just going to define a random state to make sure that all of our clusters are judged against the exact same process. If we didn't define a random state, the random state would be randomized every time it went, and that would lead to additional variability that we can't control. So right now we're controlling everything we can with the data we bring in, the number of components we use, and that stays static throughout this. So we need to make sure our random state stays static as well. So then we're going to actually assign clusters. After it runs the k-means, we're going to do the fit predict, which is going to predict a label for every player in our data set. And then we're going to get the centers for the k-means cluster centers. Our score is going to be the silhouette score, because a silhouette score can range from -1 to 1. So 1 is the ideal, like that's phenomenal, that's perfect as you can get. -1 is as bad as you can get. So we're going to take kind of the same approach of percent improvement of our silhouette score, kind of like we did percent improvement of our explained variance ratio, because we want to know where the best jump is to have the most efficient analysis. And then we're going to do the same thing. The silhouette, we're going to append the score, and then we're going to look at the silhouette scores for each cluster set. So as we can see here, I'm doing pretty good. Looks like it's going to be, so right here we have, it starts out great. Not great, but pretty good. But obviously there's more than 2. So that could be something as simple as it's, breaking out like starters and bench players, where that's going to be pretty easy to sort them and predict which one they'll fall in. And as you can see, the more clusters you get, you start to decrease in the silhouette score, but then you're going to hit a point where you start bouncing back up, and then you're going to bounce down again. So that's kind of what we're looking for here, is where's that optimal spot where we're going to have as high of a silhouette score as we can while also getting actual meaningful analysis done. Because if we broke it into 2, like, yeah, I guess 3 clusters is going to be the highest silhouette score there. But how many players are in the NBA? How much does breaking them out into 3 groups really help? I guess it would be probably like ball handler, wing, big man, something like that, which, maybe 3-point shooters, ball dominant players, and big men. I don't know what it would be. You'd have to break it out and look at the assignments and kind of judge for yourself. But, having 3 clusters really doesn't help us that much, because we're looking to break it out into a small enough group that we can have pretty accurate analysis on them without having a different model for every single player in the NBA, because that would be brutal to have to update daily for your daily fantasy, right? So we're trying to split the difference there and get the most efficient method. So we're going to do pretty much the exact same thing we did before for the components, and we're going to kind of take a look at it. And this is the silhouette score versus the number of clusters. So as we just saw numerically, now we're going to see graphically. Start here, bump up, highest one's going to be 3, and then we're just going to kind of trail down. We're going to jump up there again at 9, trail down to 12, then we're going to jump up to 14, kind of level off and bounce around a little bit more. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the difference in silhouette score. So we're going to be looking at basically the silhouette score, the percent difference. So the exact same thing we did before. So we're going to take the silhouette score and we're going to see the percent change from the previous silhouette score, which is why we're starting at cluster 3, you can see here, instead of cluster 2, because cluster 2 is our starting point, so it's not improving from anything. So we can see we had a positive improvement, negative, 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 positive again at 9, negatives, positive, 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 negative, positive, negative, positive. So that's going to represent whether we're going up or down from each point to the next here. Now let's go ahead and throw that on a graph again so it's a little bit easier to see. And see, this is what I really like about graphing this specifically, because looking at here, like, yeah, you can see some jumps like that, you know, 0.0035, 002, 01, 004, like those don't seem like that much of a different number, right? But 2 compared to 10, that's a pretty different number. That's almost triple. But looking through here, unless you are used to looking at data like this and knowing like it's a factor of 10 for every decimal point you move over, like that's a huge jump you have going up here. 12, so 13 is going to be our highest percent jump. So even though it's not our highest silhouette score, it's our highest percent jump in information that we're retaining, basically. Or not information that we're retaining, information we can gather by sorting into that many clusters. So just like, I guess, I mean, kind of a downer, we had 13 components, 13 clusters. That's not always going to be the case. It just happens to be here. So we're going to go with 13 for now because it gives us our highest percent improvement going from 12 to 13. Although 11 to 12 is a pretty big one too. But that's just because it's going from negative, a very low percent improvement up. So we don't want to see the change here because that's comparing it to the silhouette before that as well. So we just want to look at each point. So now we're not caring about how it's changing. We just want the highest possible value here, right? So we're going to go with 13. So now we just need to come down here and rerun our K-means algorithm, specifying the number of clusters instead of running it over a loop to figure out how many clusters we want, because now we know we're going to use 13. And you can feel free to use a different cluster. If you want to have the highest cluster number or the highest silhouette score total, then that's perfectly fine. Be my guest. That's up to you. That's your model. You do what you want with it. I just don't think there's much value in having 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, 7, 8. Like that doesn't do a whole lot of value for me personally, in my opinion. Your opinion may differ, and that's perfect. And you may be a lot better at this than me. I don't know. But for this example, we're using 13 clusters. Random state equals 1. And then we're going to fit that K-means algorithm. And then our Y K-means is going to be our predicted value coming off the X data set. And this here, I'm not going over pickling today because it's not entirely relevant. But pickling is basically saving your model so you can call upon it at a later date to use. When we get a little further in, we've kind of gone over all of the basics of all the different types of algorithms and models we'll be using. Then we'll go back, and then we should have enough games done in this season to have a decent data set, at least a more accurate data set, more representative data set. Then we'll kind of start going through the whole data model and pipeline. So we'll be pulling fresh data, creating models, saving models. But this early in the season, you go a week and a half and you might need to come in and make a whole new model, right? Like it's not doing too great because it's so much changes so early because the statistics are so just skewed because there's such a small sample size of games. So running our K-means, we're predicting, and again, this is a data set from last year, so it's not going to be impacted at all right now. And then we're going to create a clustered data frame. We're going to add the player column, and then we're going to add the cluster. So that's going to be the cluster they get assigned to. And then we're going to take a look at the head, and we can see here Just we got 2 matching here, Anthony Simons and Kobe White. They have kind of a similar play style, so that makes sense right off the bat. There's probably going to be some in here that don't make sense when you look at them, but, you know, it is what it is. So we need to export this out, and then we're going to take a look and go through our clusters and really take a look and see if it's making sense to us or not. So let me open that up in Excel, and we'll take a look at it. Don't need you. All right. So let's filter this out and take a look. We're just going to go one by one and see if it makes sense. So cluster 0. And don't mind this. That is an issue in the data set that I pulled. If you remember from some very early videos, the reason I started doing these is because I accidentally wiped my hard drive and lost all of my updated code. So the code we're running on right now for these models is a little bit outdated from what I like to do, and we'll get into updating it more and more, but this is just an artifact of the method I was using to pull data. It happened for Jordan Clarkson and one other player that I'm sure we'll hit soon. But as you can see, looking through here, these are mostly going to be guards, a lot of point guards, a lot of ball handlers. So ball handlers, and it's hard to tell because I'm not entirely sure when the data got pulled. But ball handlers, got some shooters in there, got some guys that like to drive. So I would say these are mostly going to be guys in the game. They have the ball in their hands a lot. Quite a few of them are coming off the bench, so not high minutes, maybe different efficiency levels. We'll see when we get to some other clusters. We look at cluster 1. All right, so we've got kind of more the in-betweens, a little bit of guards, a little bit of wing guys. Not entirely impressed with any of these guys, so they're probably going to be low usage players. Definitely low usage players. The Celtics players I'm very familiar with, Carson Edwards, Tremont Waters, like not a lot of usage guards. Cluster 2. All right, so that's quite a range for position-wise. These are going to kind of by your in-between, maybe more defensive players, athletic players. I know Shaquille Harrison, he was the defensive specialist at Chicago. You got Thon Maker, Chetty Osman, so relatively athletic guys. Romeo Langford for the Celtics. I'm not sure how he got roped in there. He played hardly any games last year. Vincent Poirier. So again, more lower minute players, but maybe more defensive players, low minutes. Not so much on the scoring for the most part. 3, into the big guys. Good big guys. Got Bam Adebayo, Sabonis, Andre Drummond, Hassan Whiteside. So these are going to be big men looking like rebounding specialists to me, if I had to pick. Yeah, I would say big guys get a lot of rebounds, or at least probably a high rebounding percentage of when they're in the game is going to be what I assume is the driving statistic there. Cluster 4, all right, bigger superstar type players: Jokic, Simmons, Julius Randle, DeRozan, Booker, Braun, Jason Tatum, Giannis. Yeah, these are the big time guys. So if you're trying to isolate out players you want to focus on to be your studs for the night, you're probably going to be looking at this cluster. And then you're also going to have your more ball handler dominant players, your shooters more dominant players. I mean, you've got Devin Booker, Jason Tatum, but these guys are going to be more ball handlers, or at least they have a lot of time of possession relative to the rest of the team. So when you think ball handlers, don't necessarily think like point guards that are bringing the ball up, but think of guys that dominate possession time with the ball. And that's how I think of it. So if I say ball handler, I'm thinking of guys that just have the ball in their hands a lot. Cluster 5. All right, so we got some more big guys. Shot blockers. Shot blockers maybe, just Robert Williams, I know. Bismack Biyombo, Jared Allen. That's what I'm thinking when I see this group. So the whole point of this is to get players that kind of play the same way, because, you know, as I mentioned before, like all point guards don't have the same skill sets. They don't do the same things in the game. So they, you know, a team that might be able to shut down a score first point guard might really struggle against a more facilitator point guard, because they have completely different styles of play. So we're trying to break out into those types of groupings So it's not so dependent on your position or your size or how many points you even score really, but how you play the game. And if you go back and look at the stats I pulled in, that was part of the reason behind some of them. So you're looking at where you're taking shots. You may play similarly, but if one player shoots a ton of threes and one shoots a ton of mid-range jumpers, like that's pretty big defensively on how you have to play against that and what can open things up for your teammates, etc. So these, to me, defensive wings, mostly defensive wings type players. No real superstars in here. You got some guys that can put up pretty big numbers, but consistently they're going to be more middle of the pack, or just very spotty with the scoring, but maybe more consistent mintage and consistent play style. All right, so cluster 7. Here we go. These are going to be very ball dominant players. These are going to be more of your guards, ball dominant guards, whereas a lot of the other, was it cluster 4? Those were going to be more wings and big guys. These are going to be the guards that we're going to be keying in on. You know, obviously, your James Harden, your Trae Young, your John Morant, Kemba Walker. Most of the time these guys are in the game, the ball's in their hand when they're on offense. Move on to cluster 8. Just Paul Watson. Who is Paul Watson? No idea. Don't care about cluster 8. We can drop that out entirely if we want. Cluster 9. All right, we got some decent players here. So big guys, facilitating big guys, maybe some scoring big guys. So these are going to be your non-traditional centers, guys that typically play off ball, have a big impact all throughout the stat sheet. They're not just scoring, not just rebounding, and not just big guys. I mean, you can see we got Porzingis here, and we got Jaylen Brown, R.J. Barrett, Kyle Kuzma, Jabari Parker. So they're going to kind of be across the board, but they're typically playing more in that forward-ish spot. However, that's factored into their offense, whether they're a legit 4 or a 3 or just, I mean, I know like the 1 through 5 really doesn't matter anymore, but everybody knows what it is, so it's easy to relate things to that. But these are going to be pretty good defensive players, pretty good facilitators. All right, so on to cluster 10. Let's see. Jordan Bone, I don't know who these guys are, so cluster 10, don't care. Not important. That's their cluster. All right, cluster 11. Jakob Poeltl, Christian Wood, Grant Williams. All right, JaVale McGee. Okay, that's a little bit different. So I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, big man, I don't know. I would be very curious to see how this is driven, because some of these guys can step out and shoot the 3. Some of them cannot. Which that was my initial thought. So yeah, interesting. So we might want to, if you got some time, you might want to take a look back and see if these guys tend to perform the same against similar teams. Michael Porter Jr., what's he doing on here? If we ran it on this year's stats, he wouldn't be on this. Definitely not. Oh, John Collins? Okay. So this might be more of your high ceiling, low floor, in my opinion, looking at the names, just the spread of them. So we might want to take a look at this. I think this is not the most accurate cluster. I think a lot of guys are thrown in here that maybe shouldn't be together. I don't think John Collins and Jan Mahimi, Aaron Baines, they should not be in this. Michael Porter Jr. should not be in. So this is one that would make me think we might need to go back and kind of retrace our steps and maybe try something a little different. And cluster 12, shooters, off the bench shooters, low time of possession in their hands. When they have the ball, they're probably taking a shot. Corner 3 type players, Yep. All right, so that's not too bad. See, outside of cluster 11, I can, you can look at it, see the players, and just off the top of your head, if you watch a lot of basketball, you can probably figure out what the grouping is. And this one, there's all kinds of, maybe this is kind of the general, all the big men that don't fit in the others we're going to dump in here, I guess. I don't know. So now you can go from this point. If you disagree with a lot more of it than I did, you can go back, you can run different components. You can run it on all 30 stats if you want. Don't even do the principal component analysis. Just jump straight in, standardize your data, and then run your K-means clustering, see how much different it is. That'd be interesting, I think. Or obviously, you can come in here and you can manually update these yourself. You can do all sorts of things. The end result of having these clusters is to have a predictive model for each cluster going into each day. So we're going to instead, because the whole point of machine learning is to kind of generate a generic general solution for a set of data. So running it over the whole set of NBA players, there's going to be basically one analysis, and it's going to do the same for every player. Terrible. You could have one analysis for every player on each team. So each team has its own. Okay, that's fine, except within each team you have a pretty high variance of how those players play and perform. You could do starters and bench players, which is fine, but among starters you have a pretty high variance. Among bench players you have a high variance. We could have broken this out into guards, forwards, and centers ourselves first and got different sets of data for each of those groupings, and ran each of them individually and had their own clusters within that bigger group to get even more accurate. There's all sorts of things you can do to get a better cluster prediction here. You'll just need to find your balance on the amount of work you're putting in and the amount of effort it takes to update and keep it up to date versus how much better it is than an easier solution. Because if you're putting in, 4 hours of extra work every day making your lineups, and you're only getting on average 1 to 2 more fantasy points a day from it, like that's a whole lot of work for not a lot. Again, I know in some of those big tournaments, 5 points can be the difference in thousands of dollars. So it can definitely be worth it when the time's right. But again, that's all up to you guys and how you want to build out your models. I'm just here to show you how to get it done so you can take it and make it your own. So that's going to be all for our clustering. Moving on, we're probably going to start getting more into actual predicting fantasy point output ahead of time, obviously, for the games. And it'll be similar to this. We'll run over box scores from last season to have a big data set. We'll go over the different ways that you can check to see how accurate it is. And we'll get into some different ways we can look at that. It'd be similar to this. We'll start with the very basic example of how to do it. Then we'll move into some NBA examples. And once we've gotten to that point, it's going to be time to go back and really take a good hard look from start to finish what needs to be done on a regular basis to put this into production, essentially, to make it something you can do daily to start getting real results. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't have a lot of the gambling history with daily fantasy sports. I come from much more of a data side and just loving basketball side. So things like ownership projections, things like exposure for players and your total number of lineups, those types of things, I just, some of them I didn't know anything about until I started doing this and everyone started asking me questions about it. So if there's things from more of the gambling side of it, the game theory going into it, that you would very much like to see, that you're interested in, that's important to you, let me know down in the comments, and I can start working to get more familiar with those things and work on ways to incorporate it into what we're doing here instead of just the data. Because I know when you're going, the goal is not to necessarily make the best lineup, because that's virtually impossible, but to make the lineup that's better than the other people playing the game. And that varies day to day. So let me know down in the comments. If you're enjoying the content, keeping up with it, make sure to like and subscribe. Keep me motivated. The more likes, subscribes, comments I get, the more motivated I am to get off my lazy bum and record a video and get it out there for you guys. So you keep me honest, and I'll keep you guys honest with these algorithms. See you guys next time.